So don't disappear, because you'll get your answers then. But now I'm really, really pleased to welcome Will back. When we saw a couple of years ago, I think, talking about freezing, and he's come back to tell us what progress he's made, I suppose, how the research has progressed. And I'm going to leave it to Will to introduce himself, and after his talk, we will have some questions from the floor, or the virtual floor. So over to you, Will.
Great, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to see you all. I see some lots of familiar faces, and it's nice to come back and talk to people about studies where I'd given a presentation beforehand. You know, I can come back and now tell you what we found and what's happening next, and it gives a real sense of progress for us in the lab. I hope it does to you as well. And one of the things that I hope that we can do after the presentation is get any questions you have, but also your honest feedback about what you think about what we've done. And we're really looking for criticism here, because this study was funded by Parkinson's UK, and I'm very well aware how much work goes into raising money for Parkinson's UK. So we want to make sure we give the best value for money. And one of the best ways we can do that is for you to be critical about the way that we have spent it. So please be honest about what you think about the work that we've done so far and what we're suggesting to do next, because that's the way we can, make sure that we can give the best value. Before I start, I thought I'd share something funny that I heard about. There was a university, someone reminded me when they were on mute, that a bunch of students got together and they saw how long they could keep their lecturers on mute for without reminding them. And they managed to get someone to give a whole lecture for a whole hour on mute, on record. And they didn't tell him, and they posted it up online. So that's the record so far for 1 hour. So I always make a real effort to try and unmute myself now, so I don't fall into the same trap. Okay, so by way of an introduction, so my name's Will Young. My background is in psychology and biomechanics. My work originally was mainly looking at anxiety and how that affects the way that we think and control movements. Particularly, I was interested in older adults who are fearful of falling, and the way that anxiety influences the way that people scan their environment and process information about people, people walking their way that they have to avoid, obstacles that they have to negotiate, and showing the benefits and the problems that anxiety can present. And I did this work at the University of Birmingham, and then went to Queen's University in Belfast, where I developed an interest in Parkinson's. And originally this came from reading studies about these changes that in walking performance that people can sometimes have when walking to a metronome or singing songs to themselves. And I became really fascinated in how the brain can do that, and how Parkinson's, because it can affect people so differently, why certain types of musical or visual strategy might help some people more than others. And during my time at Belfast, I started using the sound of actions in an attempt to try and improve the effects that people can get from metronomes, because there's a lot of research out there that shows if we move to the sound of an action, like the sound of footstep sounds on gravel, that actually creates activity in the area of the brain that we need activity to do these actions, and a metronome doesn't do that. So we started off asking people to walk in time to the sound of footsteps on gravel, and we found some benefits. And as researchers, we could show some pretty plots and show statistically that there was an improvement. I'm cutting a very long story short here. There's about 4 years work where at the end of all of this, I moved to Brunel University in London, and we had a collective meeting. This was probably around the same time that I came to visit you all, or probably just before. There was a collective meeting with the Harrow branch, Hillingdon, and I think Twickenham as well. And I presented these results, and I was very proud of them because on paper they looked very good. And I was saying, well, this is probably quite helpful, because when people walk to the sound of these footstep sounds, it actually prolongs the time for people who experience freezing of gait. They can actually walk for longer when using these sounds before they freeze. And now I see this is rather naive, but I was talking about this as if it was the next best thing. And people who experienced freezing in this collective meeting that we had said, well, yeah, that's interesting, but what we really need is something to help us get out of a freeze, not something that's going to help me walk for 20% longer, because I'm going to freeze anyway, whether I'm listening to gravel sounds or whatever you give me to walk to. And they said the two things that we should be researching are just that, how to get out of the freeze, and then also looking at anxiety and how that influences the ability for people to step from a freeze. And that really laid the groundwork for everything that followed. I suppose I'm very pleased to say now it was a very difficult decision at the time, but I dropped that whole line of work, and we stopped all of projects on the footstep sounds there and then, and all of our efforts then went into looking at strategies to help people step from a freeze. So that's the background to probably what I don't know if this is reminiscent of what I was talking about when I visited you 2 years ago in the branch, if it sounds like a familiar story. But what I'll do now is bring some slides up and tell you the story of what happened next. So hopefully you can see.
Oh, yeah.
Is that coming up okay?
Yeah, hang on.
I realise now how long this title is. So this is the story of what followed, looking at psychological factors and the opportunities to help people step from a freeze and manage this in daily life. So if that sounds okay to everyone, I will carry on and lunge straight into the background for this study. Freezing of gait at the time was quite a new topic for me. So I started looking at the research papers that were out there, and I became really interested in this idea that aside from everything going on in the brain that relates to freezing, if you look at the behavior that people have when they're trying to make a step, people who experience freezing do certain things very differently to those who don't experience freezing. And this primarily relates to a weight shifting action that people who don't experience freezing, they make before they make a step. And they do this without thinking about it. So what I'm going to try and do, I realize the lighting I've got here is very bad, but I'm going to demonstrate for you what this weight shifting looks like. So I don't know if I close the window, if this looks any better. Sorry, I should have prepared this. But if I'm going to step, I'm going to take you down to my feet now. If I'm going to make a step with my right foot here, what I need to do to make that step is to shift my weight over to the leg that's not stepping in order to free that up to make a step. If I don't do that, and I just pick my foot up, I'd fall towards the side of the stepping foot. So this weight shift that people make who don't experience freezing, this weight shift is purely just to unload the step or the foot that's going to step. And people don't tend to do this as well when they're freezing. And in particular, it looks as though this is particularly the case when they are unsuccessful in making a step. So this is characterized here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the figure on the left-hand side, this blue line symbolizes the position of someone's weight. When they make this weight shift, it kind of moves in a sort of corkscrew shape over to the side of the non-stepping limb. Whereas the red line, I know it just says PD there, but that symbolizes what happens with freezing of gait, where they don't shift their weight as much. And like I said, in younger people and people who don't experience freezing, this tends to happen without even thinking about it. And those that do experience freezing, one of the things that people tend to describe when they're trying to make a step, quite logically, is to think, move your foot. So when they're experiencing a freeze and they're trying to step from that freeze, typically the sort of instruction they'll give themselves is, right, pick your foot up, or make a long step or something like that. And the basic idea for the study we wanted to run was, instead of thinking of that stepping action, what was missing was the weight shifting that preceded that. So instead of thinking move your foot, we thought, wouldn't it be interesting to see what would happen if instead of that people thought, well, shift your weight. So I've got a sort of an image here that symbolizes this, which is a set of dominoes falling. So instead of the relatively large domino, let's see if we can get this to work. It always seems to. There we are. Instead of the relatively large domino, which would symbolize the action of making a step, what we're trying to do instead is think about a relatively small action of just shifting weight, which might represent one of the smaller dominoes earlier on. So if you can make that weight shift, it might help to start a cascade of movement that might trigger this sort of ongoing sequence of movement, and the end result being the initiation of a step from a freeze. Does that, I can look at the video images here and ask the question, does this make sense so far? The sort of the general idea?
It seems logical.
Logical, okay, that sounds good. I'm glad you think so. So around this time, I started working with a sports psychologist called Mark Wilson, who was involved in this project. And he'd done a lot of work with elite athletes who maybe struggle to perform as well as they could do when they're anxious. And he was telling me about different strategies they use, for example, with basketball players who are struggling to hit their shots. And he was saying, if I give another demonstration here, he was saying for a free throw shot, instead of them thinking, okay, I need to move my elbow like this and move my hand like this, instead, the advice that he would give to these athletes would be, forget all of that. Just imagine you're putting your hand up into the cookie jar. And he would use a metaphor or an analogy for movement. And if you look at brain scanning studies, that's a much more efficient way of packaging information about how to move and stopping people overthinking movement, which tends to be a problem as well with freezing. So this is called, in the sports psychology research area, this is called analogy learning. And if we think of an analogy for this weight shifting strategy, the first thing that came to my mind was actually a terrible idea. It was sway like a tree in the breeze. It's a terrible idea because a tree, of course, is rooted to the ground. But in the study, what we wanted to do was try and encourage people to think of analogies that were meaningful to them, and that they would find easier to memorize. And also, if it was something that they were most familiar with, it'd be something that they could hopefully recall on a moment's notice and use, first in the laboratory session where we were testing them, but also in daily life. So that was our analogy learning condition. And then our second condition here was a little bit more simple, if you like. It was just a verbal sort of self-talk to describe the movement involved in this weight shifting. So instead of sway like a tree in the breeze, it might be move left, move right, and step forward. or just simply counting through those steps. So 1, 2, and 3. So we'd have a verbal condition and an analogy learning condition. And we compared that against a baseline or a control condition, which was where we asked people to just step from a freeze in a way that they normally would, so their typical strategy. And we did this in a virtual reality environment. So participants wore this virtual reality headset showing different environments. They had a choice of different environments. One was standing on the top of a flight of stairs going down. Another was standing on a sort of cliff edge in a national park. And a third here was standing in ahead of a doorway in front of a sort of cluttered indoor scene. So all of these are linked in some way, at least in the research literature, linked to sort of worsening freezing or inducing freezing, and also to increase anxiety in some way. So whilst this might seem quite mean of us to do this, there was a really important reason to try and make participants anxious and to induce freezing. First off, we needed to induce the freezing in order to see how well people could step out of it. And second, we needed people to be anxious, because if they weren't anxious, then it wouldn't be representative of experiences that they have in daily life. And I realized that standing in a laboratory with a virtual reality headset is not representative, but increasing anxiety was one step towards that, where, you know, that to my mind, if they weren't anxious and we were showing improvements, there would be a big question mark about whether this would still work in situations where they were anxious. So people were stood on these force plates, these sort of force measurement plates on the floor, where we would try to induce this freezing. And then when a freezing started, which happened in about half of the participants, there were 35 participants in total. 17 of those froze at least 4 times in every condition. So we got a lot of freezing happening, so we could measure how well people could step from those freezes. Hopefully that makes sense so far. If there are any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves and just and interrupt me with any questions.
Just on that one, Will, on that last, I noticed he's harnessed up and safety lines on there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that in case he'd lost balance and literally just fell over, or knowing that he's actually on safe ground, he himself would know he's on safe ground, wouldn't he?
Yeah, so we felt it was really important that people, well, just purely practically, we had to, for insurance reasons, have people in a safety harness.
Okay.
And we did some piloting with this, and we found that even though people knew that they were in a safety harness, we had such a strong anxiety response from the virtual reality scene, and the fact that this is, you know, a very novel, you know, it's a laboratory with lots of wires and, you know, lots of people observing their behavior and things. I think if people didn't have a safety harness, or, you know, and someone stood behind them making sure they were safe, I think the anxiety would just be much higher, and actually it would have probably meant that a lot of people wouldn't have taken part or carried on with the session. So the harness was there to prevent them falling. Only one of the 35 participants actually fell in the lab, and where the harness was employed, but that wasn't actually when they were using the strategy. So I hope that answers the question. It was there for practical purposes, but we also wanted to make people reassured that they were actually safe when using the strategy.
Will, can I ask a question, please?
Of course.
It's Graham Pumford. I was wondering, you mentioned measuring anxiety.
Mm.
How did you make a measurement of that? And June was on your trial when you were at Brunel. and I didn't realise about this anxiety side of things. But how do you measure it? How do you get a feel of it?
Yep. So yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's something that researchers debate at length how best to measure anxiety. Some of the work we've done in the past has basically involved strapping people into what is otherwise known as a lie detector test. But certainly what we found in the past is the most reliable indicator of anxiety is people's self-report. So just telling us how anxious they feel, first off, how tense they feel in their bodies, and second, asking how tense they feel in terms of their thinking. So we didn't want to we didn't want to focus on this a lot when introducing people to the trial, because you find that if you tell people that you're trying to make them anxious and that it's a big focus of the study, then it can have it can completely counteract the manipulation, the scientific thing that you're trying to produce. So people think, oh, they're doing all these things to try and make me anxious, and it almost puts them at ease. So in our conversations with June and all the participants, we wouldn't have really been talking about anxiety that much. No. But at certain points during each of the conditions, we would have asked a question, okay, on a scale of 1 to 11, how tense do you feel, for example? So we would be measuring anxiety throughout.
Right, so I was wondering perhaps if you were measuring temperature, body sweat or anything like that, but I couldn't remember you doing that.
No, we didn't. So the body sweat is the typical way that people would measure physiological arousal, as they would call it. And what, certainly in my experience, but a lot of other people have found this as well, is that this also goes up when people are excited, when people are having lots of fun, when they're having an interesting conversation. It's purely a measure of how aroused someone is. So actually, it's not necessarily a measure of anxiety in the negative sense that we would be interested in. So yeah, so we decided to just look at the self-reported people's self-reports of anxiety, and aside to which, as you can see in the photo, people already had quite a few wires and straps on them at the time. So yeah, that was our thinking behind that.
Right, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Yes,
do chip in. But I'll move on to the results now. And on the left-hand side of the screen here, very simply, this is just a bird's eye view of people's balance under the different conditions. So we've got our baseline at the very top left, where people just use their own typical strategy. We had our verbal condition, where people told themselves to move right, left, and forward, or whatever it is that they wanted to tell themselves to carry out that sway action. And then we have our analogy condition. And all of these examples they represent where the center of someone's balance is as they step with the right foot. So the trace moves to the left because they're putting their weight onto the left-hand foot that's not stepping. And as you can see, under both the verbal and the analogy condition, people tend to shift their weight very well over to the left-hand side, but they didn't tend to do that very well in the baseline condition. And when you look at the averages for every single participant, this is a really clear trend. It's the effect that we saw in terms of the statistics was about 100 times greater than we would have needed to show a statistical difference. It was a really, really clear effect. So in other words, the weight shifting strategies, both of them worked in terms of people being able to voluntarily shift their weight. And then comes the real headline from this study, and that is when we look at the proportion of successful to unsuccessful attempts to step from a freeze. And here it may seem like we're trying to make this more complex than it needs to be. We looked at this as a ratio. So the big black bar on this bar chart on the bottom right hand side, this shows a value of 1, and what that means is that for every unsuccessful step there was about 1 successful step, so it was about 1-to-1 ratio, so about 50% of the attempted steps were successful. However, in both the verbal and the analogy condition, and this is only in people who were trying to step from a freeze, we found that the proportion of unsuccessful steps reduced by about 97%. So in other words, whenever people were using this strategy, they never, from what we could tell, looking at the data we collected, they never really failed to make a step when they used that strategy. So when you look at this compared to other strategies out there, it is far and away the greatest effect that I've seen so far. But I don't want to get too ahead of myself in saying how effective this really is, because as we saw in the last slide and was rightly pointed out, people were in a harness, and it wasn't it was a very sort of constrained laboratory environment. So I'm not suggesting that this is a strategy that's going to work for everyone and help people step out of a freeze every single time. What I think we can take from this is that it's a great start, and it's certainly much more effective than we were expecting. The other take-home point is it doesn't seem to matter whether people use a verbal or an analogy strategy in terms of the effectiveness in the laboratory. However, when we called as many participants as we could, we called them 4 weeks later, and we asked whether people had used these strategies at all in daily life. And overwhelmingly, people talked about using the verbal strategy more than the analogy. And I'll get on to this in a bit more detail in a second. But to summarize, I think people, those that did try and use the strategies in daily life, which was about 2/3 of the participants who used them regularly, they found that when freezing in daily life and there were threats in their environment, maybe they're trying to step onto public transport and they were freezing and there were people behind them in the queue, for example, their descriptions were along the lines of, I'm not going to think about, standing on a ski slalom, when I've got all these things going on around me. I need to be focused on what I'm doing. And the verbal strategy allowed people to, it's a quicker and easier cue just to go, okay, 1, 2, 3, and then try and use it in that situation. So it seemed as though people thought that the analogy strategies maybe were a bit too elaborate for use in daily life. But the other comment was that maybe they just needed to practice a bit more with the analogy. Some people, a minority, had a really clear preference for the analogy. So it seems as though it's a case of people finding out what works best for them. And then there was also a minority that just said, this isn't for me. I much prefer using my old strategy or another strategy. Yes, is that a question, Keith?
Will, can I come in again? It's Keith. I don't have Parkinson's. My only connection with Parkinson's has been since my association with the branch. I met some wonderful people, and I know that a lot of them are on the here now, and I have no problems in saying that in their presence. What I don't know is how often is this freezing situation? What is the extent of freezing by somebody who has Parkinson's? And I do apologise to those who know the answer, but I don't. And I'm trying to improve my own knowledge as I go along. It did seem, for me, just how severe or how big a problem this actually is, Will.
So many people who have a diagnosis of Parkinson's will never experience freezing. Some people will never experience it. A minority will experience freezing, but only in their upper limbs. So when trying to, similarly to how people might experience tremor, people might experience freezing when trying to perform some action with their upper limbs. And around half, there's lots of studies that give sort of very different numbers, but there is a significant number, probably around half, who will experience some form of freezing when trying to walk. And the severity of this ranges from um, uh, feeling a slight hesitation once a month, to freezing many times in a given day. So it's a really broad range of symptoms, but it is a prevalent symptom of Parkinson's. And it is also widely referred to as one of the most debilitating symptoms of Parkinson's as well. But as I'll get onto in the next, if I've got time, the next sort of the phase of this study.
Will, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry to ask a question which others know the answers to, but I do think I'm just trying to improve my own knowledge a little bit, and I do thank you for that.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Can I just ask a very quick one? I think it's a quick one. It's Graham again, Will. Was there any measure of age and weakness of people, the weakness of the limbs,
yeah,
and the age of the people in your studies taken into account?
Yeah, yes, we measured both. We also measured cognitive function. We made a whole range of different symptoms associated with Parkinson's, and these trends persisted despite any of those things. So this, whereas muscle weakness, especially in the legs, does tend to be associated with worse freezing.
Yes.
That doesn't impact, we actually statistically account for this, that doesn't impact the strength of the results. In fact, those people with worse freezing symptoms benefited the most. But that's probably makes sense because there's greater room for improvement in the in terms of their ability to step, I suppose.
It's a little bit coincidental that in our yoga Zoom class this afternoon, yoga teacher was saying about walking and raise, place, pause. Nothing was mentioned about balance. And this weight shifting seems so important from that 90% reduction, 97% reduction you were saying, and I'm going to follow that one up. Thanks for that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because it's so intuitive to think, okay, if the problem is stepping and
Yes.
people get a benefit from consciously thinking about the action they need to make, then they need to think about stepping. So it's a very simple message that I think the way that our brains control our movements to initiate a step, the first thing the brain does is to initiate this weight shifting. So that's all we're trying to do, is just get people to focus on that instead of the step. So it's just about that domino effect. So there are some things. So the PD Warrior classes, they look at what they call the penguin, penguin weight shift. And so this is not a new idea, and some physical therapy what was the word I'm looking for? So that the structured exercises will include this weight shifting, and a lot of people, I mean, like I'll get onto in a second, I think the resourcefulness and creativity of people that experience these symptoms, it's the best asset, or the best resource that we have as researchers, because just like with people thinking up their own analogies to carry out these actions, it is it's far better than anything we came up with as researchers. And a lot of people, well, I'd say a lot of people, that's not true. There were 2 out of the 35 people actually said that they'd figured out this issue with the weight shifting by themselves. And there was one lady who sang Nelly the Elephant to herself to get herself weight. She called it revving up. So she would sing Nelly the Elephant and she would weight shift. She'd put one foot slightly behind the other and she would weight shift. And she was basically doing exactly the strategy that we're testing. So that was the one participant where we didn't see such a big change between the baseline and the other conditions.
We all know who that was.
Yeah. So she was, figured it out. So yes, I think it is really important, and hopefully it will be, well, the next step will be to see whether this is actually useful in daily life on a much larger scale. So in the interest of time, I'll briefly cover this bit. The reason why I'm showing this rather industrial looking scene is because this is a new laboratory that's been built at the University of Exeter. It's called V-Simulators, and it is the only facility of its kind in the world. The previous studies, like the one I've just described, and all other, to my knowledge, all other studies on freezing of gait, they have all involved the use of quite small balance sensing devices called a force plate, which are about 60 centimeters squared. And V-Simulators, the facility, the big sort of grey square in the middle, that is a 3.7 meter squared force plate, which means that people, instead of trying to find ways of inducing freezing on a very specific area of a laboratory, what we can do now is ask people to move freely around this huge force plate, the world's biggest force plate. And we can ask people not just to take steps forward, like in our study, but also ask people to turn and do all these different actions that we know is associated with freezing. And the brilliant thing about this facility is that we can measure every freeze that happens on this plate. At the same time, there is this gantry. You can see that sort of snake-like cable that's hanging from the roof. That is what connects to virtual reality headsets, so people can walk around the whole scene in the virtual reality environments that we've created. So this is a really exciting opportunity to take the studies that I've just described and test whether this is still useful when people are trying to step in much more complex environments. And what we've proposed in our recent application to Parkinson's UK is to, first of all, test out the same strategies in a safe laboratory. They'll be in a mobile harness in this environment as well, and we'll test to see if that's still safe and are still effective in more dynamic tasks before we take this out into daily life later in the project, and we see whether this is effective both when people are on medication and also when freezing happens most, when their medication is wearing off. So that's our next, that's what we plan to do next. How much time do I have to talk about anxiety?
I think you've got lots of time, but can I have some thoughts from the floor? You know, because it's really interesting. Everybody?
About is it that chamber you've got there, the V-Simulator? Is that panel there? Does that move whilst people are on it? Then does it? Is that the idea of it?
So the V-Simulators does move. This isn't something that we're planning on using in the in this project, but one of the really novel things about it is it does move in every direction. So it's the technical term for it. It moves in 6 degrees of freedom, so it can go sideways, upways, it can tilt, and all sorts. And the idea there is you can simulate very complex environments. So, for example, the vibrations you feel when traveling on a train, on public transport, vibrations that we know affect the way that we can feel what our body's doing. So, absolutely, the next thing to do is to, in the virtual world, put people in public transport and then simulate. I tried it for the first time a couple of months ago, and it's really a really eerie feeling. It's so realistic, the feeling of being on the train that we've got. That it's the first environment we've built.
Can I ask a question, Will?
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? We're kind of told that the freezing and the lack of movement in the limbs is like a neurological chemical reaction or lack of reaction. What you're saying is that it's kind of not about that so much as about what the brain is saying to the limbs, so you can override the chemical problem.
Yes, so it's absolutely is a neurochemical. The origin of the problem is neurochemical.
Yeah.
But I suppose to summarize my point is that the thing that's going wrong is a very specific channel in the brain. And there are, I mean, the part of the brain where there are problems is about the size of a pea, and we know the brain is much larger than that, and there are lots of other parts of the brain that are largely unaffected. What I'm suggesting is that it is possible to change the way that people focus their attention and control their actions in a way that makes the best use of the part of the vast majority of the brain that still works very well.
So is it mind over matter? You know, to coin a very.
In a sense, it is. It's I suppose it's a way of just. It's a bypass system.
Okay.
So just, yeah. Okay. So if you'll indulge me for a little bit more, this is where I take things out of the laboratory. And what I'd like to talk to you about is some interviews we did with the participants that took part in the last study. We asked people to describe things that make their freezing better or worse, and we carried out analyses in 2 different teams. So I'm a psychologist, and I have very clear ideas about what I think is happening in terms of anxiety and freezing. So we thought it best that I didn't do the analysis on this, because I would, whilst I try not to be biased, there is a very good chance that I would be. So instead, we got an expert in someone who specializes in analyzing interview data, a wonderful researcher called Mariel Norris. And she did this analysis, and she came up with the results that I'll show you now. And I'm pleased to say that my predictions came through. I would have probably predicted that, similar findings to come from this. But I'd like to describe to you the results that show where we focus attention, how that seems to influence freezing, and opportunities that this creates for intervening and coming up with ways of helping people and people helping themselves. I should warn you that when I go on to the next slide, the model is going to look very complex, but please bear with me. Okay, it's not as complex as it looks. Okay, so please don't switch off. I'll take you through this step by step. But this image on the right.
Oh, okay, that's Simon. Shall I send him? I'll send a message to him. Okay.
I'll just pause for a second.
Yeah, okay. So can I just ask Simon to let Rose back in?
You're on mute, Simon.
Yes, thanks. I'll just unlock the meeting again. Sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, Will.
No, it's fine. It's probably a good moment so people can pause for breath after seeing this image.
Oh my God.
So please bear with me, because I'm going to talk you through this figure. So these are the results from the interviews as people described freezing as they experience it. And the first thing to mention is, if I move my cursor around, can you see my cursor? Yeah. So I'll point to the different parts. So we're going to start off with point A here. And this relates to, I've gone to my thanks already. This relates to this whole triangle, which shows the spectrum of everything from a very light freeze or even further free movement, all the way down to a very deep freeze. And people described a range or a spectrum of freezes all the way from free movement to a very deep freeze. And what people described was that a lot of the time they could move up and down on the spectrum, even within a given freeze. So they could start off feeling as though it was a fairly light freeze, but then something might happen and it would become a much deeper freeze and much harder to get out of. So that's the first thing to mention. Point B, over on the left here, is that it helps to focus attention on the movement you want to make. So point B here is the arrow that goes up. So if you focus attention on a movement you want to make, like the weight shifting, then that seems to help people but not just weight shifting, focusing attention on making the step, keeping your back straight, whatever. It seems to different things work for different people, but focusing attention on movement, people said help. And I should also say that these interviews they took place before people took part in the study, so it's before we told them about what they'd be doing in the or it's before we trained them with weight shifting. I hope that's the case for you anyway, June. So point C here is the downward arrow. So many forms of distraction can make freezing worse. And many of these relate to anxiety and time pressure. So this is arrow C that points down. So there are lots of examples of this, but in summary, this all seems to be things that distract attention from arrow B. So people try to focus on their movement, but something draws their attention away. And a lot of these things relate to anxiety. So this could be thinking about what other people are thinking of them, thinking, why am I not better at this? Thinking, what would happen if I fell? So these thoughts that drag attention away. And one thing that came through quite clearly was that there is quite a fine line between arrow B and arrow C. So for example, someone could be thinking, make a step, but very quickly that could become arrow C if you think, what would happen if I don't make a step? And that fine line is enough to make the transition from making a freeze better or making, being more able to make a step, making that transition to actually going towards a deeper freeze. So I'll come back to these distractions later on. I should probably also say that there's this circle. Where's my arrow gone? So I'm making people dizzy with the arrow cursor movement. There's also this circular movement here. And what happens here is this is within a freeze. If people get distracted and they feel that the freeze is getting worse, what that can do is make them even more distracted. So they're now thinking, oh no, the freeze is getting worse. And that reinforces the distraction. The next point is point D. So this is experiences of freezing. So this is at the bottom here, the square box at the bottom. And it's at this point that I should probably say, I don't know whether this is a disclaimer or what, but I feel like something of a fraud talking or sounding like I'm knowledgeable about this, where I absolutely don't know what this feels like, because what I'm about to describe is clearly very pertinent and very difficult for a lot of people. So I'm not pretending like I know what this is like. This is purely a reflection of what people said in the interviews. So point D is about a sense of the declining self, where people talked about a sense of vulnerability, negative self-judgment, and identity jeopardy. So this is feeling like the freezing is affecting their sense of identity and their ability to cope with these different situations. So things that I'm sure are very difficult for the participants to talk about. But for our analysis, it's incredibly important, because this seems to set the basis for what happens then in future freezes. So I've just been talking about box D at the bottom here. So this feeling of lack of control over the freezing. But you see these big looping arrows that come back, arrows E and F. What this does is it sets the scene for these distractions that happen next time a freeze happens. So if people are feeling like they don't have control over the freeze, what seems to happen is next time they're in a situation where a freeze might happen, they're thinking, I'm not going to be able to get out of this, and that lack of sense of control is just contributing to the distraction, and it becomes then a vicious cycle that's reinforced with anxiety and the rest of it. So what also came out in this box D at the bottom, if I can find my cursor again, here we are, is the positive side of all of this. And that is that people talked very clearly about certain strategies for resilience. So strategies that they've come up with to deal with all these negative effects of the freezing. And people described really, in some cases, quite elaborate plans that they would make to either avoid freezing or deal with freezing, or, and help give a sense of control. And the creativity that people described was really, it was fascinating from a research perspective, but also very humbling when you think of, you know, as researchers, I think we are very good at trying to distill things down into a simple story. And what these interviews did was make us realize it's so complex, the lived experiences of this freezing. It's far more than any brain scanning studies could describe. But hopefully, you know, admittedly, this is a very sort of complex figure that I'm showing. This is actually the simple version of what came out of those interviews. But if we can try and appreciate the complexity of what's happening, then that paves the way to create strategies that might be helpful and might help people to select certain strategies and what works best for them. So in other words, it's a complex situation. So we need a complex research tool to help guide physiotherapists and, you know, neurology consultants in the right direction to actually help people overcome this. But what it all points to is helping people move from arrow C of being distracted to arrow B and using these strategies. And if there's a strategy that works well, like weight shifting or any other thing, if that is effective in helping people give people a sense of control over the freezing, then hopefully, I don't know if this is true, but hopefully it helps to cut down that vicious cycle that's happening on the left-hand side of the diagram. That's our hope. The research is showing a very good start in that process, but our next step in the research journey at the moment is to try and test this some more and see if this really works. So I realize I've gone way over time. I can still see those faces that I can still see are still awake, so I think that's a good sign. So I'll say thank you very much. This is the team, apart from the lead, the researcher that did the day-to-day work is someone called Amy Maslevec, who did a really fantastic job in this study, and this actually paved the way for her to go on to a really excellent research position at Imperial. So she did some excellent work on this, and she's getting a lot of credit in the research world for the work that she did on this. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to discussing further both here and in the future.
Can we thank you, Will? That's really, really interesting, and I, from speaking from myself, it sounded like it came from the heart.